Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Do More with Less. We talk to the world's top marketing leaders and thinkers to understand and share how individuals and teams are responding to the very blunt instruction to do more with less. And today I'm talking to Robert Norum, ABM consultant and founder of Opportunitas. Robert is going to help us understand why ABM right now is such a massive focus and yet why it's so difficult to execute and what we need to be doing about that. So, Robert, thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending some time with us. I guess my first question is, why are we in 2026 and ABM means so many different things to so many different businesses?
It's a great question, Mark. I mean, there's definitely a lot of confusion over what ABM is and definitely what makes good ABM. It seems to be something I coined a phrase a few years ago as the gift that keeps on giving, in the sense that everybody is trying to get more intelligent with their marketing, particularly obviously in B2B and enterprise, and ABM seems to be the smart way of doing that. But what started perhaps 20 years plus ago now as companies looking at their most important accounts and prospects in a very focused way, one-to-one ABM, has obviously exploded, with martech and now AI. So without any question, there are a lot of different ways you can approach ABM.
And just to be clear, let's set some parameters for the discussion so everybody's starting at the same starting line. Is one-to-one ABM possible and being well practiced anywhere? Is that a thing? Is that happening? Or is that still very much kind of the omni-channel of marketing strategies?
I think one-to-one ABM is definitely happening at the enterprise level without question. Yeah, there are a lot of very large, global organizations that are doing highly effective one-to-one ABM. And that is really where it started. The challenge, of course, is how do you scale one-to-one ABM when, it's typically time consuming, budget intensive, resource intensive. And that's one of the reasons that we have one-to-few and one-to-many, which we might want to unpack, as alternatives. The whole rationale for one-to-few was to scale from one-to-one, if you like, and that took it from a single account at a time to perhaps looking at 10, 15, 20 accounts, typically in a vertical. And one-to-many, obviously, which exploded onto the scene really, when the martech explosion happened with companies like Demandbase and 6 Sense, enables you to look at hundreds and potentially even thousands of accounts at the same time. You can imagine the level of intensity and the level of focus and personalization clearly gets lighter touch as you drop down those different tiers.
Right, so this is where we start then, because I've been in many different companies that told me they were doing ABM, and it didn't look to me like ABM. It looked to me like they had a list of hundreds or thousands of accounts, hundreds of thousands of contacts, and that they were treating them all with the same spray email. Maybe the personalization amounted to names on emails. That was it. So I'm going to say, and you can challenge me on this, but I'm going to say for me, that doesn't feel like ABM. So unless you tell me something smart now, I'm discounting that from our ABM definition and conversation. No?
I think you should. Because that's really targeted account marketing, which is saying we have a list of accounts, we're going to send them some stuff, and putting, dear Bill, dear Bob, dear John at the top of the email clearly is not account-based marketing. It's a superficial level of personalization.
What do you say ABM should look like? Forget the numbers now, the one-to-many, the one-to-few. What should it actually incorporate? What elements and ingredients make for a really good ABM?
Well, you're not wrong, Mark, but I would say if you're thinking about starting out with to develop an ABM strategy, the first thing is understand your total addressable market. The second thing is think about which accounts should we be focused on, in a manageable quantity, if you like, from day one. And then which accounts would we upgrade from that initial, if you like, what I would call a one-to-many play, which is effectively the new demand gen. It's targeted marketing to accounts in as personalized a way as you can make it. If you come in from that, then you start getting into key accounts sitting in key verticals. That for me would be one-to-few. And then you get to that one-to-one play. And so I think actually having a view of which accounts sit in which tiers is important, because not all accounts are created equal. And also thinking about the balance of how you use ABM between new customer acquisition and actually upsell and cross-sell to existing customers is also really important.
If the issues that Robert and I are covering in this episode of Do More with Less are of interest to you, if ABM seems like a strategy that your business should be leaning into, but is nowhere near currently, come and talk to us at Orbital X. Visit orbitalx.com to see how an entire team, an AI system, a whole performance infrastructure can be yours for the price of one marketing hire. We cover off the data, the intelligence, the performance, the audience, the content, and everything else you might need assistance with. Our execution is flawless. We do owned, paid, and earned, and we'd love to talk to you. Visit orbitalx.com and see if our version of ABM might suit you with a stripped-back marketing resource in need of support. Now, back to the episode. And with everything you've just described to me to make the base ingredients of a really good ABM strategy, are we there? Are we good at that?
I think it's a significant piece of work. And I think, there is a danger that people take one of two approaches. They either say, we'll pilot a couple of accounts and see how it goes. And if you have a complex sales cycle, which might be 6, 12, 18 months, then that takes a long time to show whether you're actually making any progress. And other companies, I think, are kind of at the lighter touch end, where perhaps they go off and buy a piece of tech and they think, we can blast out now a bunch of personalized emails to a couple of thousand companies, and that will all be great too. And obviously those are polar extremes of companies starting out with ABM. But in my opinion, neither of those are going to crack it. The two pilot accounts, there's a good chance that you won't land anything in the first 12 months, and therefore people will decide that ABM, we tried it and it didn't work. And if you come in at the other end, then, as you said earlier, is that just spray and pray marketing to perhaps a slightly tighter set of target accounts?
If I'm coming across as skeptical, it's sort of the journalistic side of me from the past, wanting to poke holes and drive for perfection, or drive for better, really. And I don't know of any marketing strategy that's absolutely certain to work until you've got that wide-angled lens and agreement on who your customer is and what pains you solve. And often that's the first thing we consultants or partners have to, that's the first conversation that has to be had often. So, you've obviously been ABM, one of our industry's top ABM thinkers and executors for top thinkers and practitioners for 14, 15 years. Okay. Is it a frustrating engagement that you have to get through this first part, or do you find that there's still some love and joy in helping people get to that first base?
Well, for me, there's a lot of love and joy, but there's definitely work to be done. So I think it's critical that companies have a really crisp, clear understanding of what ABM means for their organization. To your point, I think it's critical that the leadership team get it, want it, and buy into it. And of course, they're going to support it. And then you need to bring the rest of the organization with you. Most importantly, that's obviously engaging sales, BDRs, SDRs, but also customer success and delivery teams. So from that point of view, I wouldn't say it's nirvana for me, but, helping companies do that is a pleasure. But it is an educational process. And as you say, very often people come into ABM with an idea it's a sort of sticker or a magic wand they're going to wave at something and everything's going to be great within the next 30 days, when this definitely needs to be a long-term strategy.
I think when you said earlier that sometimes companies want to test it with a couple of accounts, ABM feels holistic and entire and a commitment. It doesn't feel like the sort of thing you can have one foot in, one foot out and be A/B testing, or indeed letting it go to see what happens and making a decision based on a period of time where only two people were running it, for example, which again is something I've seen before. And it felt gruesome. It felt, even though we were talking about ourselves in former companies as running an ABM strategy, it felt like we were just kidding ourselves. It felt really, really, I felt like a fraud. We spoke about this yesterday, right?
Yeah. I buy that completely, Mark. This idea that you hire somebody to run ABM and then it's fixed, is a concern. It is definitely a business strategy. And we did touch on the fact that ABM, if you could turn the clock back 20 years, would we have called it ABM, account-based marketing? And possibly not. I did a keynote at the ABM conference last year, and I introduced John Mojer from Genesis, who's a good friend of mine. And he said, ABM isn't account-based marketing at all. It's account-based mindset. And I think that's a really nice description for it, because if ABM is going to fly, it's going to break down silos in the business. It's going to change the way you behave. And fundamentally, I think it's going to join the business up, if you like, to be focusing on your most important accounts and prospects, and treating them in a fundamentally different way. And that's not about tipping your toe in the swimming pool to see if there's any water in it,
So without putting marketing noses out of joint, should ABM not be sat exclusively with marketing anymore?
I think that's a really interesting question. And of course, with the sort of advent of the chief revenue officer, with revenue marketing is a new category, apparently. I mean, I thought marketing was always about generating revenue. But I think without question, it needs to be co-owned, and it might be the CMO and the marketing team that drive the adoption. But without question, the chief revenue officer or the VP of sales, the sales team have to be bought in and engaged. And the same applies, I think, if you're looking at existing customers with whatever those teams look like. And typically in large organizations, that's called the customer success team. But anybody that's involved in farming and upselling and cross-selling to existing customers should be an integral part of an ABM strategy.
So can you outline for me, when you go into an organization to start with and you start setting up and putting the pegs in, I assume that from the very first conversations you're talking to both marketing and sales, and hopefully somebody higher up with a C-suite type role to oversee and show some sponsorship and some executive buy-in. What do you need to get things going?
Yeah, it's a good challenge, Mark. And I mean, I think the first thing to say is this is not about asking people to do something alongside their day job, something incremental, because that obviously would be a concern. How on earth do we fit that in? It's actually about refocusing the day job, So from that point of view, whilst most of my conversations tend to start with marketing, because they tend to be the introducers or the sponsors of ABM, I think they realize, and certainly my role is to educate them very quickly, that the sales organization and leadership, and of course the C-suite, if that's appropriate, need to be bought in as well. So then I think the whole point of ABM is about focus. It's about focus of budget, it's about focus of resources, and it's about, as you touched on earlier, really concentrating your efforts on where you think you're going to see the best return, which of course is your ICP. So in that sense, there may be some recalibration of the business involved. And if you think about the old world of marketing, it's run events, make lots of noise, generate lots of leads. We'll call them MQLs. We'll give them to sales. And guess what? The latest stuff I saw from HubSpot said that 87% of MQLs never make it to a sales qualified lead. So in that sense, marketing are just on a hamster wheel doing the same old thing over and over again and expecting different results, which, to coin our old friend Einstein, is the first sign of madness. So from that point of view, I think it's about being smart. I've even heard the term smarketing, which you might have come across, sales and marketing. I'm slightly techy, but it's there. From a sales perspective, what are we trying to do? We're trying to say, stop running around trying to find opportunities. We're going to find the right accounts. We're going to do research and insight into those accounts. We're going to find the right contacts and the people sitting within the buyer group. We're going to start to open the doors for you. And at the appropriate moment, whether it's BDRs or account execs, we're going to put you in the right place at the right time. Now, that's not increasing their workload. If anything, it should be reducing it. And it should be saying, play where you're going to see the best possible returns. So that is an education process. And particularly if companies are stuck in a sort of status quo, or we've always done it like this, of course, that requires change management. And that normally, as you intonated, comes from the top down, which is why it's so important that this is not something you're trying to push up the organization. I think it's something that needs to cascade through the business.
And how often, therefore, do you sell directly to the top of the business rather than the marketing team as your first engagement? Do you get that opportunity a lot?
Often I start with marketing, and then it's almost an education process to, if you like, to recalibrate. Without, of course, naming names, I went to see an interesting business recently, quite a sizable business, and they wanted to talk to me about some help I could offer them with 2 pilot one-to-one accounts. And well, you won't be surprised to know that I've now changed that, and we're now talking to a raft of different people in the business. It's already gone to the CMO. My kind of sponsor, if you like, is now taking this up to the C-suite, and in fact is discussing it with the CEO. And now it's not about 2 accounts. It's actually about how do we implement a strategy that says this is how we move forward as a business.
Amazing. Listen, the way you've described ABM, even in the last 10 minutes, it sounds 2 things actually. It sounds like the perfect do more with less approach. Minimal wastage, working together to go after fewer accounts potentially, but the right accounts with a more holistic offer and stance in the deal, and gain more from the at the end point. But it also sounds dead simple and obvious. It sounds obvious. The way you described it earlier, just a few minutes ago, makes me think, as all the cleverest people in marketing always make me think, why haven't we been doing this for centuries? Why is ABM now coming into its own as a fashion after 20 years of us getting here, and we're still not getting it right? How much work is there to get this up and running? How long might it take? And during that period of ramp up, are we still doing business as usual? Are we still selling?
Yeah, I think that's a great challenge, Mark. And, do I have a magic wand that I can wave at every business saying, well, you just flick the switch and you're into ABM territory? Then the answer is obviously no. So I think that there's clearly going to be a sort of an element of crossover. I think it's business as usual until you decide that you're actually starting with ABM. I think the pieces that I've talked about, which is define ABM, engage your leadership team, bring sales with you, even thinking about training your internal resources, I think those can be done relatively quickly if the will is there. And by relatively quickly, I would say within a month or 2. And I wouldn't say you turn everything else off in the meantime. Equally, I think there are a whole bunch of things that you're doing with your current marketing that actually could probably fold into your ABM program. So there's an element, if you like, of assessing the value of what you're doing today and working out how you could do it better with an ABM lens on it. And then back to the sort of short-term versus long-term, hopefully without sounding too pretentious, I've been talking recently about bimodal ABM. And what that is basically saying is if you have a long-term strategic play with ABM to your most important accounts and prospects, but you have quarterly revenue targets, how do you have a twin speed? And essentially, that you need to have your eyes on the major prize, which is the strategic long-term accounts with the most value, but you need to be generating, action pipeline opportunities on a quarter-on-quarter basis. And in some ways, that's almost down to the type of ABM you're going to be doing. So if you're looking at one-to-many and perhaps looking at 500, 1,000, maybe even a couple of thousand of pre-qualified target accounts, that's where you're going to be generating the short-term pipeline opportunities for BDRs and SDRs to follow up with. At the same time, you might well be looking at a number of key verticals and a number of key accounts within those. Those would be your strategic plays. So I don't think, you need to be locked into thinking everything takes forever and is onerous and time-consuming and expensive. You need to think about how you can use ABM in a tiered fashion, if you like, to get to achieve different objectives, and you would turn the heat up in different areas depending on what you're trying to achieve. We haven't got into sort of thinking about new accounts versus existing customer growth, but there is often massive untapped potential with existing customers that businesses don't spend enough time thinking about, and I think that's a strategic play for ABM.
And we've covered at length now the entry in or the kickoff or what you need to think about before launching or getting into it for the first time as an ABM strategy. What does if we were to fast forward a couple of years to something close to maturity, what does ABM look like when it's going really well? Is it a very, very targeted content strategy? Is it understanding the champion plus 25 other stakeholders in an enterprise business that need to be engaged and kept up with through whatever sales rooms, digital sales rooms, or whatever over the next 18 months? How do you define it when it's beautifully running and doing its job? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I created a few years ago called the full stack ABM model. So if you imagine the sort of the virtual target, you have the total addressable market, and that's the feeder for your ABM program. You have your one-to-many layer, which is the target accounts you know that you're going after, and that might be 100, 500, 1,000. You pick a number that's appropriate, but based around your ICP. Clearly within that level, you need to understand the buying group, and you need to be talking to personas in ways that would be relevant and interesting to them. So that's about smart content. If you come in a layer to the next tier, then you're into one to few. Let's say you've cherry picked 5, 6, 7 verticals that are mission critical to you, not all at once, but one by one. Within that, there might be 10 to 20 accounts that you think are really important. So there you're creating really bespoke content for a segment and then personalizing it for each of those accounts and potentially for the stakeholders that sit within them. And then if you have your sweet spot right in the center, which obviously is one-to-one, most organizations might be doing 5, 10, 15 of those a year, and depending on their size and resource, it's not going to be a massive number of accounts. And even within one-to-one, you might have deal-based marketing where you have some major pursuits where you want to use an account-based approach to really give you the best chance of winning. So that full stack ABM model is what I would say is sort of, I won't say nirvana, but is how it should be running. And the feeder obviously is total addressable market. That enables you to focus on the accounts one to many. In one to few, you've obviously got your key verticals, and none of those sort of tiers, if you like, are mutually exclusive. You can be upgrading accounts as you go, and other accounts might look less interesting for some reason or another, and you might downgrade them. So I think realistically, if you're in the enterprise space or even mid-market space, then ABM should be your go-to-market strategy. It shouldn't be something you bolt on or experiment with. It should be something that the organization sits behind and really makes it work. And that's why it's so important that you have sales, marketing, customer success, and even delivery teams really understanding who those accounts are and their relative value.
Do you have any advice or guidance or even just your own opinion on what a marketing team should look like for a perfect, fully bought in, committed ABM strategy?
I think it does differ to in every organization. So it's hard to come up with a rule of thumb. I think one thing I would say is that SDRs or BDRs often sit most effectively in marketing. If you're playing in the ABM space. I think, if you're looking at really large accounts that are mission critical to the organization, then you do hear of some of the really large organizations having, quote, ABM heads, perhaps where they would only look after 3 or 5 accounts a year. But that's pretty rare, and you're going to have to be talking about accounts that are worth hundreds of millions there. So, I mean, you can see those don't grow on trees. So I think, generally speaking, you can look at the environment you have and make it work. There will be times when you want to bring somebody in who perhaps has ABM expertise, whether that's internal or external. But generally, I don't think it's about completely reconfiguring the business. It's about looking what you have in the organization and then giving it that account-centric filter to say, how do we actually make this work in an appropriate way?
Yeah, I buy into that so much. I think marketing structure and resource now is at the top of everybody's mind. I think most marketing teams have seen shrinkage. I think some of it might come back over the next couple of years, but AI plus constant need to watch investment have combined and shrunk most marketing teams to the barest. And I think that at that point you genuinely need to understand your level of opportunity with an ABM strategy for starting now. What are you saying to the market that's fresh on your mind or imperative for you to address on the ABM discussion. What's the latest that sort of you're putting out there?
Yeah. Well, back at the ABM conference in November, I talked about the ABM operating system as a methodology, if you like, for marketeers to really add commercial value to the business. And that was all about breaking down silos and really getting in early and thinking about how you address the whole customer lifecycle. I did a joint keynote at the European ABM Forum just last month, as you said, in Amsterdam. And the theme for that was shift left, shift right, which is actually borrowed from the software development lifecycle. But to explain what that means, most companies are fixated on the sales process, find the customer, sell to the customer, win the account, move on. But actually, 70% of the buying cycle takes place typically before the customers engage with vendors. So there's a huge aspect there of shift left, which is how do we get in early, build brand awareness, engagement, trust, credibility, and make sure that we've covered off the whole buying group, not just a few randoms, who are going to become our MQLs. So the shift left is get in early, but of course to your target accounts that you've pre-qualified. And the shift right is what happens after the sale. The onboarding process is almost like the first stage of renewal, because if that goes well and then they start to see value, then you can start to think about upsell to cross-sell, and ultimately building that trust and advocacy where your customers become potentially your most valuable resellers. Certainly the people who are going to give you endorsements and testimonials and speak at conferences for you. So in that sense, I see ABM playing right across the customer lifecycle, from early stage engagement right through to the post-sale experience, which of course ultimately should lead to renewal or growth of that account. And that's the advice I'm sort of giving, and the direction I'm trying to take ABM in.
And is that possible for every size of company? We talked about enterprise a couple of times. You've mentioned mid-market. That sort of investment in the time, the trust, the credibility building, the relationship. Do you find there is a way of applying that to smaller mid-market or even small businesses?
I think there is. I mean, if I go back several years, I was working with a startup who had created a really nice, piece of e-commerce, if you like, that enabled big brands to sell direct to customers, when of course normally they were disintermediated by retailers. And we worked out that actually, if they could go and talk to Procter and Gamble and various other major brands in that space, that they would potentially have their fastest route to market. So we took an ABM approach, one-to-one, to 2 or 3 really major brands, P&G, Diageo, etc. And they were highly successful in that kind of engagement. And they had 5 employees, So it's definitely not limited to companies that are massive. I think the key thing is, as you alluded to right at the beginning of the call, understand what it is you've got, what the value proposition and messaging should look like, what your ICP is, and then focus on how you actually land that in a compelling way. And I think you could start that as a relatively small organization. Of course, you're going to get more sophisticated. And equally, if these companies don't know who you are and they're not familiar with the brand, then selling to them is going to be almost impossible. So building brand awareness, I call it account-based branding, to target accounts, on whatever number of accounts that might be, is really important. Nurturing them through the sales process obviously speaks for itself. But then again, once they bought something from you, they should be the easiest people to sell more to. And they should certainly be organizations that you want to build that relationship with, where they will become advocates for your business. So in that sense, I think any size of organization should be thinking, with an account-centric lens to it. And of course, making the right decisions on where to invest intelligently.
Robert, I'm going to sum up, because I want to tell you just how high value this has been. I think if I was to take all the main urges on your your advice and your take or your description of a really, really good account-based mindset, from really understanding your customer against your value prop and what you can offer, really understanding who is most likely to buy, working as a team across all the go-to-market functions, and of course to have that golden sort of arch of buy-in and encouragement and focus and protection from above. To me, whatever you call this strategy, it's just brilliant marketing. It's the marketing we all want. So thank you for your time. Very, very best of luck as you keep going and spreading the word. And from now on, I'll be thinking about an account-based mindset as opposed to a marketing strategy. So thanks for your time again.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. I'm glad it's landed with you, because I know as an ex-journalist, you're probably a tough audience. So if it's landing with you, it's landing with most people, I think.
Thanks.